Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Well, good evening and welcome to the show. Huge show tonight with the events in the Middle East, of course, over the weekend. And what's ahead for us here in Australia as we enter the final days of this Voice campaign. D-Day now, of course, on Saturday. Here's what's coming up tonight on Credlin. We'll go live to Israel and get the latest on the ground following the horrific terror attacks from Islamic militants Hamas over the weekend. Another horror set of polls for the Yes camp as both campaigns declare they'll fight down to the wire. The latest numbers have Linda Burney's own seat voting no, and talk even younger voters are rejecting Labor's Voice. She wiped the floor last night in a debate with Ray Martin, and tonight she's headlining a no rally in South Australia as that state looms as a state that could swing the result. Of course, I'm talking about Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price will cross live to Adelaide. And shameful scenes in Sydney as a Muslim preacher celebrates the murder of innocent Israelis. This is exclusively the same preacher who also shared the stage recently with the Prime Minister at an iftar dinner where Anthony Albanese pushed his voice. So will the government now acknowledge this connection, given strong criticism against Penny Wong already to date for her calls for Israel to show restraint?
I think it is always the right thing for Australia to urge restraint and the protection of civilian lives.
When people talk about Israel having to show restraint, it's completely and utterly the wrong time for that sort of language.
But first, we now have an even better idea of what being under existential threat looks like. Rockets raining down on people's homes, innocent people taken hostage, and civilians massacred in the street in cold blood. Now, what's happening in Israel is a horror show. The Islamist fanatics behind the slaughter in Israel don't simply want to destroy the Jewish state, but quite literally drive the Israeli people into the sea as part of their vicious death to the infidel ideology. This was a completely unprovoked attack driven by malice and hate. Yes, the Gaza Strip is poor and crowded, but as Israel has proven time and time again, it's more than happy to be a good neighbour, provided the Palestinian leadership is prepared to accept Israel's right to exist behind secure borders and to stop the incessant hate against the Jewish people. For years now, it's been assumed that Israeli technical mastery, plus the pragmatic leadership of countries like Egypt, the Gulf states and even Saudi Arabia, was making Israel more secure. But if Iran was still threatening mayhem and arming Palestinian terror groups, including, as the Wall Street Journal reports, in these terror attacks over the weekend, what happened in Israel on Saturday has rightly been likened to 9/11, and it shows that the price of peace really is eternal vigilance. That you can't count on a determined enemy not to find ways of thwarting the best laid defences and to strike when you least expect it. That there's no line a terrorist won't cross, including abducting infants, the elderly, women and children, and slaughtering innocent civilians. What matters now, apart from defeating this incursion and trying to ensure that no country or movement thinks it's safe to threaten Israel, is to end the moral equivalence we are seeing from leaders who should know better, implying that terrorist groups on the one hand and the Israeli government on the other hand can be just as bad as each other. There was a hint of this in our Foreign Minister Penny Wong's call over the weekend for Israel to show restraint, she said, in its response. Now, I ask restraint? Where's the restraint from Hamas, with over 700 Israelis now confirmed dead? When your citizens are murdered in cold blood and terror gangs are roaming the streets inside your borders, the last thing you need is someone as senior as Australia's own Foreign Minister counselling impartiality between the fire brigade and the fire. Israeli security forces sometimes make mistakes, as all do, even our own. But there's a world of moral difference between the only liberal democracy in the Middle East, where all faiths can freely practice their religion, where the Supreme Court can routinely challenge the government, and where all minorities are represented in the parliament, and on the other hand, the militant terrorist enclaves of Gaza and the West Bank, where poverty is used by the terrorists as a device to keep hatred alive. It's also important to remember, especially here in Australia, where we have no enemies on our borders, the world can be a very dangerous place. And to focus more on the real challenges we face, as opposed to all the first world problems that tend to preoccupy our political class. Now, I wonder how many Israelis are fretting right now about climate change or trans rights or wearing masks on public transport. But lest we all think every Australian thinks as we do about the right of Israeli citizens to live free and safe in their own country, these scenes in Sydney should horrify us all.
I'm smiling and I'm happy. I'm elated. It's a day of courage. It's a day of happiness. It's a day of pride. It's a day of victory. This is the day we've been waiting for.
This preacher, this Muslim imam, is Ibrahim Dardoon. And here he is at a recent iftar dinner this year with the Prime Minister. Dardoon, who gave a closing prayer in the Prime Minister's presence, here he is not some random wayward cleric who's crossed a line in Sydney on the weekend, but someone with repugnant views, horrific views, that no Australian can possibly support, who we now know has the ear of our national leader. Now, as I said, the price of peace is eternal vigilance, as much here in Australia as everywhere else, that we do not sanction this sort of intolerance and hatred in our own country, that we stand with Israel and we condemn these attacks on the world stage. Now, as you know, I have always thought that the Voice was an act of constitutional self-harm. Why would we have thought for a moment that it was a good idea to give just one group of people a special say over how all of us are governed based on their ancestry? Why would we have thought for a moment that having this voice entrenched in our Constitution, with its own special chapter, no less, would be a mere advisory committee, as a PM tries to tell us? Why would we have thought for a moment that further empowering the same voices, like Noel Pearson and Marsha Langton and others, that have been driving Indigenous policy for years would suddenly make a dramatic difference to the lives of those in remote Australia, especially when we already have 11 individual Indigenous voices in the National Parliament, which should be the place where all of us have an equal chance to be heard by the people we all elect to serve us. All of us. We all elect them based on our democratic system and not the colour of our skin. Well, the longer this debate has lasted, the more reservations people quite rightly have over this divisive voice, with support in the latest news poll today falling to just 34%. If the polls are to be believed, and that's an if, this is the Australian electorate reasserting their control over the political class, who have tried to tell them for months, indeed decades, what to say, what to think, and then withhold critical detail in the case of this referendum that's designed to hide its true and very radical agenda. I just hope that today's polls don't lull people into assuming it's all over and stop manning polling booths and, God forbid, not bother even to vote. Even now, there is still immense moral pressure to guilt people into voting yes based on the wrongs that some of our ancestors may have perpetrated against some Indigenous Australians' ancestors, as if people should today be compensated for crimes they haven't suffered by people who never committed them. Of course, there's a lot happening right now, the horrors we see in other parts of the world, plus the cost of living pressures that millions of families are under. Mortgage repayments, we know, having doubled over the past 12 months, unaffordable power bills, the cost of food being put on our table or petrol in our car, making it tough for so many. But this referendum on Saturday is a watershed moment for our country. Are we to remain, in Bob Hawke's immortal words, a country with no hierarchy of descent, no privilege of origin? Or are we to be divided henceforth into two classes of Australian based on how long some of our ancestors have been here? And like so much that happens to us, the outcomes here on Saturday are entirely in our hands. We the people get to decide. We the people get our say. So let's make this rejection of any attempt to divide us by racial lines as strong and as emphatic a no as possible. All right, let's go to Canberra now for the headlines. Sky News political reporter Olivia Casely.
Good evening. Australian leaders have united in condemning Hamas's strikes on Israel.
An extraordinary attack targeting civilians in an indiscriminate way.
Whatever people's views about the history of this conflict, we can never condone the targeting of civilians and the taking of hostages.
These attacks are horrific and the Greens condemn them, but we also condemn the occupation.
But Peter Dutton has criticised the language used in the government's response, after Foreign Minister Penny Wong called on Israel to exercise restraint and protect civilian lives, a sentiment she's standing by.
I think it is always the right thing for Australia to urge restraint and the protection of civilian lives.
When people talk about Israel having to show restraint, it's completely and utterly the wrong time for that sort of language. It's a time to stand with the people of Israel to make sure that these women and children in particular are recovered from what is a very dire situation.
As the United States moves to provide munitions and send military ships closer to Israel as a sign of support, the opposition leader is also calling on the government to do the same.
We should be one of the ally nations, as we've seen through our activities in Ukraine, where we stand up for peace, we stand up for democracy.
Well, we have not been asked for military assistance. The Israeli Defence Force, of course, is very formidable.
Politicians have condemned pro-Hamas celebrations in southwestern Sydney.
There's nothing to be celebrated here. This is a tragic loss of life, including innocent civilians cut down in the prime of their life.
Australians are being reminded that supporting terrorist organisations such as Hamas is a criminal offence.
This is an organisation where in Australia, according to Australian law, it's illegal to support or affiliate or associate oneself with that organisation.
Seat-by-seat polling obtained by Sky News shows that the yes side in the upcoming Voice referendum will win just 22 of 151 House of Representatives seats. It shows that only the inner city of every capital city will be seeing yes in the majority. Victory for yes will not occur in any Liberal seats, the polling suggests. Although it will come close in the marginal seat of Sturt in South Australia, held by James Stephens, and Bradfield, the marginal seat held by Liberal frontbencher Paul Fletcher.
All right, we're going to analyse all that polling data out today with Dennis Shanahan, as we often do on a Monday. But let's get a breakdown of the numbers where they stand from our elections guru, Tom Connell.
First of all, the latest poll has the yes camp sliding another 2%. This is the news poll today, and the no side ticking up to 58. So way short, even if somehow all the undecided go to the yes camp, you can see they only get to the low 40s. What about the trend and when this really set in? Because we know, if you go back to last year when the prospect was first on the table, we had the yes camp as high as 65%. So certainly it was disappointing for them how much support they lost. But this shows how recently the yes side was really close and in contention. Go to June here. 43 to 47 is not a good position to be in, but that is perfectly possible to be able to reel that back in, considering at that point you had 10% undecided and you had a lot of soft vote. This is not so long ago in June. So at that point, this was still on this contest. Since then, it's been one-way traffic. The yes side losing nearly 10 percentage points down to 34, and more than that going to the no side. So they've picked up yes supporters and they've picked up some undecideds. That's how quickly this has gone off the rails, considering this was something that's spoken about a lot since last year, even though we only knew the date in the last few months. So it was still on in June, you could argue there. What about where it's been lost as well? Well, if we look at political support, you can see the coalition. This has been a big part of why this referendum has failed. We don't see referendums passed in Australia when one of the two major parties or the coalition with the Liberals and the National Party disagree with it. And this shows why. Look how stark that is, 82% no. The other problem for Labor is they've struggled to get enough support amongst their own voters as well. 48% yes at the moment, 42% no. So if you apply those 10% roughly equally, you get Labor up to 53% from their own voters. Nowhere near enough to count a coalition. Strong support from the Greens. Interesting on the other, because you would include Teals on that, but clearly other includes other parties such as One Nation voters. So on that mathematics there, you're never going to get a successful result. What about age? All the talk of older cohorts would struggle to support it, but younger cohorts would help. Well, the older parts, right? At the moment, 70% voting no and not many undecided. But look what has happened to younger voters there. 18 to 34, only 46%, and 35 to 49, the next cohort up, only 37%. So younger Australians are actually not favouring this voice. Even if the vote was just them, it still wouldn't get over the line, at least on those numbers. Then you get by region, again, the city versus country divide. This is not as stark as you might expect it to be. 35% in metropolitan areas, 31% in regional areas. So yes, more likely in metropolitan areas. What's happening here is you will see more people right in close to the city, and particularly around the Green seats or votes they've done well in, will be much higher than that. But I suspect what we'll see on election night, outer suburbs and even closer suburbs have not supported the voice like Labor needed them to, like the Yes campaign needed them to. And the regions, that's still a disappointing figure. Being that low would have always been hard to make that up.
All right, joining me now, the Australian's national editor, Dennis Shanahan. We've gone through those numbers there pretty carefully. I think what's really interesting, because part of the narrative, if this goes down next week, will be the lack of bipartisanship, terrible coalition, they cause the voice to fail. But on those numbers there, you've got 48% of Labor voters, 42%, 48 yes, 42% no, 10% still undecided. So they've not been won over by the Prime Minister's arguments. Now, I tell you, you'd be wanting, if you were Labor, to be doing better with your own people. And even when you look at the demographic splits, I mean, this is extraordinary. We're now seeing 49% of the 18 to 34-year-old cohort voting no, only 46% yes. And in not one of those demographics, Dennis Shanahan, is the Yes campaign ahead.
Yes, Peter, these polls are devastating for the Yes campaign. It has been a trend since the formal beginning of the campaign. It has just been an ever-widening trend. More support across the board for the No campaign and falling support for Yes. Even the early hopes from the Yes campaign that there were soft voters who would turn and vote for Yes, well, those soft voters have turned and voted for No. The undecided figures are very low. It is very difficult to see this referendum succeeding on Saturday. The number of people already voting is an indication that people want to get out. They are getting out to vote. So I think that the No fears that there may be a low vote will probably not be fulfilled, and that it does seem that people have just not had enough information. They have rebelled against the idea that they should vote for something without seeing the detail. And I think across the board, with the lone exception of Green supporters, everyone has wanted more information. Polling has shown this, that people wanted information, and the management of the campaign, the refusal to provide that information, how the voice would work, has absolutely killed this idea and damaged the whole question of reconciliation and race relations in Australia. This has been a failure of management, a failure of persuasive politics. There has been no persuasion, and a failure of leadership as far as Anthony Albanese is concerned, totally unprepared, and I think we are looking towards a very bad loss, bad for everyone, with the loss of this referendum.
Yeah, well, bad across the board. Bad because it wasn't done in the orthodox way. There was no constitutional convention. Legal scholar Frank Brenner was out there today saying, and he's a yes supporter, as you know, as saying if they'd had the legislation, even in draft form, out there to allay concerns and then have a debate about some detail, it may have given us a different result, he says. We mentioned that poll that you just picked up on there. 60% of people say we want more information. Only 30% are voting with the Prime Minister, who says, just trust us, we'll work it out afterwards. I mean, this is in free fall now, Dennis. People said to me last week that they'd seen the bottoming out of the yes numbers here, that it couldn't get any worse for them. Your point about people getting in early and voting, it's up from where we were this time last year in the federal election. We've got probably about 300,000 more people pre-polling. Postals are down, but we're likely, I think, to get a result on Saturday night looking at these sorts of numbers. And I tell you, it could even go 70-30 against this vote.
Well, it certainly could. I got a badge today for voting at the old Parliament House at the Museum of Democracy in Australia. It was a great place to vote. There were a lot of people there. A lot of people are voting. We know 2.5 million have already voted. And I think that what we will see is, particularly in the regions, in suburban areas, even the areas, the demographic areas of university-educated people, are falling all the way. There isn't a group supporting this. And I think that what we're seeing is now also a bleeding in to criticism of Anthony Albanese. I think what we've seen, it's extraordinary that over the last few months of this campaign, voter satisfaction in the news poll with Anthony Albanese has fallen by 12 percentage points. Now, that over that short period of time is the same loss that Kevin Rudd suffered when his campaign to introduce a carbon pollution reduction scheme failed, and he was seen as being distracted from the issue of asylum seekers and the Oceanic Viking in Indonesia. I think that Anthony Albanese is suffering the same fate because electors are saying they don't think he's been concentrating on the issue that they wanted him to, and what's more, he's failed on that particular issue. I mean, Kevin Rudd described, climate change as the greatest moral challenge of our time. Anthony Albanese. Yep. And Anthony Albanese has been saying the same thing about The Voice.
I want to get a comment from you about the events over the weekend, the horrific events in Israel, but I want you to come at them from a domestic context, please. I'm about to cross to Israel and speak to some media specialists on the ground, but two things here, Dennis. The comment from Penny Wong that has reverberated all weekend that Israel must show restraint in its response. She backed that comment in again today. But the exclusive revelation I have for my viewers tonight is that those intemperate, horrific comments from the Muslim imam in Sydney on Saturday night and Sunday, I think it was as well, celebrating the death of innocents. We know too that there is another pro-Palestinian rally in the Sydney CBD tonight. Well, this imam has the ear of the Prime Minister. This imam shared a stage very recently with Anthony Albanese. Give us your take on the domestic play-out of these issues in Australia.
Well, I think that the horrific attack on Israelis needs to be condemned by everyone. I think that Penny Wong was unwise in suggesting restraint on Israel. People did not suggest that, the Ukraine should be restrained in its response against the Russian invasion. I think that you have to be very careful about that. Anthony Albanese absolutely said Israel has every right to defend itself and can do what it needs to defend itself and its citizens. They are the right attitudes to take. And as for groups who are supporting the invasion, the terrorist attack, this is a concerted terrorist attack designed to disrupt peace talks between Saudi Arabia, Israel and the United States. It is a cynical political ploy where they are using murder and kidnapping for political ends. The real problem for the Labor Party is in this atmosphere, apart from the use of restraint or whatever, the real problem is that just recently the Labor Party conference shifted its position on Gaza, Palestine and Israel, and it is now formal policy in the Labor Party that the Gaza is occupied territory. Now, this is going to be difficult for Labor to sell, and no matter what, the long history of friendship with Australia and Israel, including the founding of the State of Israel, Australia has a long political tradition of supporting Israel and through the UN, and I think that this will not play out well politically if there is seen to be any criticism of Israeli responses to defending themselves against terror attacks.
You are spot on, Dennis. I'm going to cross to Israel now, but we are in foreign policy terms, I think, with Labor and that decision at the August National Conference in treacherous policy waters. I'll leave it there, Dennis. Thank you for your time. Let's go now, as I said, to bring in my next guests on the ground in Israel. I'm joined from Tel Aviv by Marcus Sheaf, CEO of the education charity Impact C, a former journalist, I might add too, and Times of Israel journalist Amy Spiro. Marcus and Amy, thank you for your time. Sincere, abject condolences for the loss of Israeli citizens here from the people of Australia. I'll start, if I can, with you, Marcus. Give us a sense of the mood in your country today.
Well, the mood is resilience, and the attitude of Israelis is bravery. Civilians living in the border desperately fought these terrorists. As you know, on Saturday morning, on a Jewish festival as well, Simchat Torah, hundreds of Hamas terrorists who rule Gaza infiltrated the internationally recognized border with Israel, attacked Israeli communities and families in their homes, and armed killers hunted Israelis house by house. They executed children in front of their parents. Pensioners were executed in the street. And we know now that terrorists have murdered at least 700, including young and old, and that figure is expected to rise. You know, children sat on the floor in a safe room on a kibbutz while their father was outside with a gun in his hand, and they heard the door open, they heard shooting. They didn't know if their father had died or succeeded in killing the terrorists. So clearly Israelis understand that Hamas is a genocidal, cruel death cult. It is backed by Iran, and they are sadly resigned to the fact that it must be faced, must be beaten, so that normal life can resume for Israelis and, frankly, for Palestinians as well.
Amy, a lot of concern about the failure of the world-renowned Israeli intelligence services in detecting the scale of these attacks. What's been the reaction in Israel, and do we have any clue as to why these very highly coordinated attacks occurred at this time?
Certainly, it's, one of the biggest, if not the biggest, questions going on. I think everyone in Israel is reeling, still really doesn't understand what happened. We don't have a huge amount of answers. What we've heard mostly from officials is, this isn't the time for questions. We need to fight this war, and we will answer those questions later. A couple things. One is that, the vast majority of the Israeli soldiers who were manning these posts along the border are either killed or kidnapped, and we are missing a lot of information. There's no doubt that this was a massive failure of Israeli intelligence. That's very clear. It seems that they You know, the Hamas terrorists were planning this for weeks. They managed to shoot out the cameras. They managed to take people by surprise. And I think this is a moment and a day that we'll be dissecting for months, years, maybe even decades.
Marcus, I've spent time in Sderot, so that's down for Australians at home, close to the Gaza border. So I can't imagine what it's like for families to have gone through what they've gone through over the weekend. We know about the hundreds dead at that music festival. The abductions, the people taken back into Gaza, some horrific images that we've seen here and around the world. What happens next?
Well, as you know, Peter, Israel left Gaza in August 2005. They uprooted 9,000 people, and that was done with hopes to live peacefully with the Palestinians on the other side of what is an internationally recognized border. But instead, Hamas took over the region. They committed to 17 years now of terrible violence, terrible destruction. So I think next is for the international community to get behind its removal, which it is doing, for the sake of Israelis, Palestinians, and the whole region. And I think when this is done, next is also for us to stop and for once and for all the radicalization of young people by UNRWA in its education needs to be put to an end, because this is one of the key root causes of the terrible brutality that we have seen over the last 2 days.
Yeah, what Marcus is talking about there for people at home is worldwide funding into UN organisations in these territories. We'll come back to that tomorrow night. There's a lot there in that. Amy, just quickly, how concerned is Israeli government and others that while you're focused on Hamas in the south near Gaza, obviously in and around that area, that you'll be exposed in the north to Hezbollah? There was some noise from Hezbollah, obviously in the recent hours, and also too, is the American government, President Biden, seen to be doing enough and quickly enough to support Israel?
Yeah, certainly the border with Lebanon and the activity of Hezbollah is a huge concern. Israel is not blind to that. You know, a lot of the reservists, the Army reservists that have been called up over the past 2 days, you know, they're not all being sent down south. You know, they're also reinforcing troops in the north, reinforcing troops in the West Bank, you know, replacing troops that are being sent down south. So there's an eye on that border, certainly. And we even saw when Biden spoke that he made sort of very pointed comments about, you know, warning anyone in the region not to take this as an opportunity. And that was widely seen as being directed towards Hezbollah. In terms of U.S. support, you know, there's aid on the way. They're sending munitions. They've redirected some warships. You know, I don't know if there's a question of doing more or doing less. I think the Israeli people are grateful for U.S. support. And I think we're also just waiting to see how things play out and how long this goes on.
Marcus Chief, Amy Spiro, thank you for your time. I stand with Israel. The vast majority of Australians stand with Israel, and we send our thoughts and prayers to you at this very difficult time. All right, coming up, we're joined by the No Campaign's Boda Sia, Senator Nampa Jimpa Price, live from a rally in Adelaide to get the latest from the ground in one of the referendum's key battleground states. Plus, you won't believe the comments made by former New South Wales Liberal Matt Keane, well, former Treasurer. I think he's still a Liberal, but who knows? He seems to think young Australians know better than older Australians. That and the fact that he doesn't even understand the Liberal Party. Coming up, new figures show the cost of Daniel Andrews' cancellation of the Com Games well above $500 million, while his replacement Premier Jacinta Allen refuses to take part in a parliamentary inquiry into the axed event. Plus, more on that situation in Israel, the reaction in Australia, with one sports star's disgusting tweet about the attacks on the weekend. But first, let's go back to The Voice. My next guest has been barnstorming the country long before the polls started to turn and the unpopularity of The Voice became apparent. She was taking up the fight to the Prime Minister and all those rich corporates and sporting clubs when it looked like their millions would turn the tide. A real David and Goliath battle, if ever there was one. Well, tonight, She joins us from out of her latest campaign event in Adelaide, of course, talking about that warrior for equality in our Constitution, Opposition Shadow Minister for Indigenous Australians, Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price. Jacinta, welcome. Great to have you on the program. You're absolutely in the home straight now. I know you're busy. I know you've barely spent a night in your own bed. The last time there was a no rally in Adelaide, protesters were out the front hurling abuse at you and other guests. Give us a sense now. You've seen the polls again today. It's worsening for the Yes camp. How does that match up to the mood you're finding on the ground?
Oh, look, Peter, the mood is incredible on the ground, particularly in the last week or so. It's just really amazing. Like, each time I've come back to the capital cities, at each event, the mood has just grown. There's been more excitement, more sort of electrifying responses from the audience, more sort of Australians who are galvanised in the idea that we need to stay as a united country, that we shouldn't be divided, that we want what's best for everyone, including our most marginalised. And it's certainly the sense today, it's the feeling today. I've got incredible people backing me up. I've got wonderful volunteers, and I'm so grateful for their support, for the support of volunteers right across the country and Australians right across the country that are certainly helping in terms of carrying me along to the finish line. It's wonderful.
One of the things I thought was really interesting, and I made this comment with Jenna Shanahan a moment ago in the polling out today, was this idea that it's only the boomers and older Australians who are voting against the Voice. There is not one demographic that is majority voting yes, and indeed even young people 18 to 34 are in the no camp in large numbers than they are in the yes camp. This says a lot about where ordinary Australians are compared to the messaging we've heard from the elites, isn't it?
Absolutely, Peter. I mean, this is evidence that the government, that the Prime Minister have put a terrible proposal before the Australian people that has lacked absolute detail, cannot demonstrate how it's supposed to support our most marginalised, and they've just assumed that they could get the support of Australians on the vibe that young people wouldn't look into this further for themselves. You know, I think it's also a result of the fact that, you know, our kids have been taught not to be proud of themselves. There's been incredible division. You know, the identity politics has really done damage to our country, and I think Australians of all ages are turning around to say, enough's enough. We're not going to have this anymore. I mean, you know, I've got a wonderful young fella, a part of my support group this evening. You know, they're getting younger and younger in terms of the support, because this young bloke here wants to grow up in an Australia where he's proud to call himself Australian because of the merit, because of the things that he's going to achieve, the opportunities that this country presents for him. And that's what it's been all about. Certainly the sense that I've been feeling on the ground as I've been going around the country, that's the feeling tonight. And, you know, I'm looking forward to the end of the week, finally, where we can bring Australia back together again after this division.
Given the polls, given the overwhelming support they say is there for the no vote, is there any concern you have that turnout won't be there on Saturday, that people will think this is already won?
Oh, look, I'm hoping and I'm urging all Australians to make sure you continue to come out and cast your vote. Continue to, if you're undecided, do your research to understand just how empty this Voice proposal really is, to understand the consequences that voting yes could bring about as a result of this referendum, and not be complacent. Certainly for those who are supporting the no vote, make sure your vote counts. It's no time to be complacent whatsoever, despite what the polls are telling us.
Well, you're almost there, Jacinta. I know it's been a heroic effort from you and your team and Warren Mundine and others. So all our very best to go right there until 6 o'clock on Saturday night. We'll speak to you on the other side. Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price, as I said, Boadicea. She is absolutely Boadicea. All right, coming up, Sonny Bill Williams. Well, he's tried to equate the Hamas terrorists with freedom fighters in Ukraine. Plus, we'll speak to the author of a new book that shines a spotlight on one of Sydney's horrific murders. Coming up a bit later, the brilliant Hedley Thomas for a bit of change of pace. He's the bloke, teacher's pet, who took on the issue of the Chris Dawson murder of his wife. He has a new book out. We'll take you through that in a moment. But join me, our two proud Queenslanders, my Monday night panel. Former Resources Minister, of course, member for Hinkler, Keith Pitt, and forward Howard Government Minister, Sky News contributor, Gary Hargrave. Gents, let's get straight into it. A lot to get across. Peter. Keith, your reaction to what we've seen in Israel in the last 48, 72 hours, but also that call from Penny Wong for Israel, in the face of its murdered civilians on its own territory, for Israel to show restraint after being invaded by terrorists. What do you make of the Foreign Minister's comments?
This is just atrocious, appalling, horrifying, just horrific, reprehensible. Peter, I condemn it, absolutely, without hesitation. And for every Australian, can you imagine if this is your hometown and weak men with guns have kicked the door in to murder innocent women and children? And I think, unfortunately, Labor's got the balance wrong here. Their response has been less than convincing, and we should be out there strong, standing with Israel. And I expect that they will respond as they should, and I think every Australian will support them.
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, I played some comments from a preacher, Gary, in Sydney over the weekend, celebrating the death of innocent civilians in Israel. He is the same imam who shared a recent stage with the Prime Minister for an iftar dinner. So he's not just some wayward preacher. He is someone who has the ear of power in this nation. We've got Sonny Bill Williams. I know he's idolised by a lot of sporting fans. He has tried to equate these Hamas terrorists with Ukraine freedom fighters.
Yeah, look, and that is just a disgusting intervention by him, and he's got some real brand damage because I put it like that because he is incredibly popular and would probably sell a lot of things from soaps to shirts, if you get my drift. But, you know, how can you possibly have any decency about you to choose to support those who have stripped women naked, marched them around the street, gone into a nightclub, killed 260 people, indiscriminately dragging people out of homes, murdering elderly? I'm sorry, Peter, the middle ground will never, ever side with that. And it's just a craziness that anybody would even see them in any sort of glowing light. Look, you know, I understand the frustration that many supporters of the Palestinian community would have for their circumstance. But you know, Israel will act in a moderate and appropriate way because that's what democracies do, and it's such a rare commodity in that part of the world, and they have to be accountable to the people and the international community more than any of these terrorists would do. But it should have been a no-brainer, and Sonny Bill Williams needs to now go and take his head and, take it out of the public gaze for, I think a long time to come.
Keith, I want to go quickly to you, if I can. A comment from Peter Costello. He's about to retire as chairman of the Future Fund at $260 billion there. He's chairing the investment of that money on behalf of all Australians. He's certainly built it up. That fund's performed better than any other almost in the country. He says you've got to keep it there, the capital there, for another 10 to 20 years. Politicians in Canberra, we feel, are already looking to raid it. You've got a former Labor Minister, Craig Emerson, saying, well, the Future Fund has got to assist the government's plan for decarbonisation. That's a big concern.
Peter, it's too late. Jimbo Nomics, he's already stolen it and put it against the budget in the last one. That's how he got such a big surplus. Yeah. Well, plus, of course, the resources sector and hard-working Australian taxpayers. But it's been quite an astounding turnaround from where it started to what it is now. And I think it was a very wise investment by the Howard government, and obviously Peter Costello has managed it incredibly well. And now you've got former Labor MPs who are suggesting you should throw it at more of this green madness, regardless of whether there's a return or not, simply because, well, the vibe, because you might feel good about it. We need to get back to the point where numbers are numbers, budgets are budgets, and numbers don't have feelings. But unfortunately, under the current Treasurer, the current Prime Minister, the current government, that's not going to be the case, and they've actually said very clearly and vocally that they want the budget to be about feelings and social outcomes. Last time I checked, it was just maths.
Yeah.
What's this with Matt Keane telling young Liberals that they should not listen to mum and dad or grandma and grandpa and vote for the Voice? We can see in the polls today young people are walking away from the Voice like everyone. But I mean, just because young Liberals are young doesn't mean they're stupid.
No, and Peter, I mean, that's the point. The young Liberal movement around the country have got the same ambitions and the same idealism of anybody of that particular generation, always have. But Matt Keane should stay the heck away from them. People are not listening to Matt Keane. Matt Keane is now a bloke who's on the losing end of just about any argument he seems to mount. Any argument he mounts, he seems to lose. And what's happening instead is that young people are coming to older members of their family and asking them for advice, and they're following it. So good on young Australians. They've worked it out.
And I think they've worked out Matt Keane. Jen's got to leave it there. See you both next week on the other side of this referendum. All right, stick around. As I said, the brilliant Hedley Thomas. This is the bloke that took on Chris Dawson. New book out. I'll take you through it. Welcome back. Just before I bring in my next guest, I'm sad to report that police have warned the Sydney Jewish community not to attend the CBD tonight for the lighting of the Opera House sails to commemorate the events in Israel over the weekend due to safety concerns. We know there's a pro-Palestinian rally in the Sydney CBD. All right, let's go now to this new book, brilliant new book, out from the brilliant Hedley Thomas. This gets back into those murders, the murder of Lynette Dawson by her then husband, Chris Dawson, a case that gripped us for many, many years via that podcast, The Teacher's Pet. Well, the man who went back and looked at the murder of Lynn 36 years on and has led to the subsequent trial, of course, and imprisonment of Chris Dawson is Hedley Thomas, and Hedley Thomas joins me now. I think this podcast was extraordinary. I think your reporting, Hedley, was extraordinary. Like so many Australians, I was absolutely captivated by it. We all hope to see the resolution that we have now seen. Tell us why the book and what's there in the book that we don't know now.
Thank you, Peter, and you were incredibly supportive of me and the podcast investigation in 2018, and I was very grateful for that. The reason I'm releasing a book, the reason I decided I wanted to write a book is because there is so much more in this story that I was unable to reflect during what was a very pacey podcast series. People were coming out of the woodwork to talk to me about the experiences that they had while going to Cromer High School or while associated with Chris Dawson and other members of his family, and of course with Lynn, who we now call Lynn Sims in a special request from her family. I also wanted to develop a memoir that would possibly explain to people how journalism, really risky investigative journalism, is conducted. And the Australian newspaper and News Corp has backed me very, very solidly with the investigations I've done into this murder, a murder that occurred 41 years ago. And if it hadn't been for that kind of support, we wouldn't have got to this place. But lots of people don't know what is going on in newsrooms, the kind of advice we ask for and take from lawyers behind the scenes, because we were taking enormous risks in calling out a killer when he hadn't been convicted of anything. And I think that a lot of people will learn a lot from being taken right inside, right to the centre, the heart of an investigation as it's unfolding.
I can't wait to get into it myself. You're right to remind me, Lynn Sims. I want to honour her memory by calling her maiden name, Lynn Sims. You've got speaking events coming up. What can you tell us?
Yeah, who would have thought that I'd attract a crowd at places like Canberra and Melbourne and Brisbane, but there are so many people who have been moved by Lynn's case and by the podcast and the subsequent events. The murder trial, of course, culminated in the guilty verdict last August, and then the carnal knowledge trial that occurred this year led to a further conviction. So the speaking events are my attempt to answer questions from members of the public and also have conversation, very candid, open conversation with professional interviewers on stage, and I'm really looking forward to that. In fact, some of my old school friends have told me that they're coming along, and people who read the book will also realise there's another amazing coincidence there, because Chris Dawson taught at my old high school. I missed him by just weeks in one of those sliding door moments that you couldn't have made up.
I've got to leave it there, Hedley. I'm out of time. It's been a very hectic news day, but your book's out tomorrow. I know my audience is going to get out there and get it. I'm going to get out there and get it, and all the very, very best. All right, that's it for me tonight. Back tomorrow night, of course, at 6. Up next, Andrew Bolt.